That's kind of, I guess that's how I would describe my voice on the guitar, is that it's just sort of a boundless expression of the sonic war that's kind of going on in my head at any given time. I started playing guitar in the 90s, early 90s. I was definitely a child of the early alternative grunge music, all the Seattle bands, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Soundgarden. Once I heard that sound, I just fell in love with the guitar, and I knew I kind of wanted to play it. So that was my early inspiration, was really just learning that sort of style, kind of a sort of a looser style than what I play now. But that's how I sort of cut my teeth, learning those kind of riffs and those sort of songs. And then from there, just, I guess, progressed into heavier music, more aggressive music, got into punk rock and hardcore, and eventually metal, and I guess more technical styles of playing. Somehow that all sort of formed this weird conglomerate of influences that helped to shape the early days of Between the Buried and Me. Over time, just sort of used all those influences to find my own voice with the guitar. My voice on guitar, it's all about, really having no limitations in the way that a guitar can sound, not only tonally, but even as far as like melodic movement and stuff like that. There's really no wrong way to play. I think a lot of people focus on, music theory and everything's got to sort of make sense. And for a lot of years, that was sort of what I thought too, that everything had to fit in sort of a box. But then as I got older and grew and stuff and started developing my own style, I kind of realized that that kind of stuff's not that important. What it's about is whatever sounds you hear in your head, no matter how bizarre they might be, if you can take those sounds from your head and transfer them to the tips of your fingers, that's really the name of the game. This is just sort of a vehicle for things that I hear in my head, and I've been lucky enough to have been able to play for long enough to where the language of music in my brain has somehow been able to manifest itself on the guitar. It could happen anytime. I've written riffs on the toilet. I've written riffs, Selkies, so one of our, that riff, came to me, almost in a dream. I was, half awake, half asleep or something, and I woke up and I just heard this, this riff in 7/8, and probably half asleep, picked up a guitar and played that riff, and it ended up being the beginning of a song. So I think music can come to you anytime. And honestly, rarely does it come to me organically when I'm holding a guitar. It's actually hard for me to be creative when I'm holding a guitar. It comes to me when I'm driving, when I'm watching a movie, again, when I'm sitting on the toilet, when I'm drinking coffee, anytime where it's almost, I feel like I'm more creative with music when I'm not even in a musical setting. I'm not plugged into an amp. I'm not even holding a guitar normally. I'm just sort of hanging out. Then I'll hear something in my head, like a weird melody, or maybe it's a rhythm, and then I pick up the guitar. I try to assemble those thoughts on the instrument, and then things sort of start organically finding a path, and then I might say, oh, and then I might accidentally do something that sounds cool, and then you start fleshing out ideas like that. Anything can inspire musical creativity. It can be life experience, it can be, you know, a good day, a bad day, a good movie, a bad movie, all that kind of stuff. Like anything can really inspire you to write music, and that's what's kind of beautiful about it. I think it's pretty rare that the exact thing in my head actually ends up being the final product, especially in a band setting. You know, sometimes it's just a skeletal idea that ends up, you know, being built upon by other members of the band. So, which is another sort of magical thing about playing music and being in a band with other creative people, is that something that you came up with can become something so much bigger and more expansive than the little truncated mini idea that I came up with, you know, when I was on the toilet, you know. So it rarely do I come up with an entire, you know, obviously I'm not a Mozart, you know, I don't come up with these huge pieces instantaneously. It requires sort of putting simple ideas on the table and then seeing where they go and allowing my other bandmates to be inspired by them, which then in turn would inspire me more, and then, you know, we build from there. One of my early guitar idols when I first started playing was Rivers Cuomo from Weezer, because the Blue album had probably just come out, and, you know, obviously super catchy pop song structures, very well written songs, great singer, but he also had a really, I thought for the time anyway, he had a very distinct guitar sound. You could clearly tell that he could play. I mean, people might be surprised. One of the first riffs I probably learned was whoops. So, like, you know, very simple song, but from a guitar perspective, like, it was cool the way he took, you know, very simple chords, G, C, D, and kind of manipulated them to sound a little quirky, and like stylistically it was a little different for at the time. So he was voicing, you know, his G chord and that little arpeggio, he was voicing it. You know, he had this B flat in there and a B in there, and it created this weird kind of dissonance. And then he just moved the shapes. It was like taking the most basic of chord progressions and making it kind of interesting sounding. So early on, like, Weezer was a huge inspiration for me. Oftentimes we joke at sound check, if we don't feel like playing our music, which is sometimes technically challenging, we'll bust out, you know, the old classic.
I've heard it all before.
Whoops. We're half joking, but at the same time, Green Day, another band, you know, they kind of came out with Kerplunk, and Dookie kind of came out when I was just playing guitar and getting into that kind of music, and those were probably some of the first songs I really ever learned, you know, because they were easy to play, but at the same time, you know, it gives you a good idea, like what works melodically. And he played some solos back on those early Green Day stuff, and see how the notes work with the chords, and it gave me kind of a baseline knowledge of like scale theory, basically, like what scales work with certain chords. So as sort of rudimentary as some of that stuff can sound, it helped me at least learn the nuts and bolts of playing guitar. Knowing now, I'm almost 40 years old, so I spent a lot of years, you know, practicing scales and doing exercises and playing to a metronome. And I think, unfortunately, you do have to do that kind of stuff to get better, I guess, you know, technically to get better. In a more musical sense, I think you have to be like, you have to study what you're playing. So even if it's something as simple as that Green Day, you know, which is, 4 chords, something as simple as that, it's just a matter of like literally really just sitting down and saying, why do these notes work with one another? What's kind of going on that makes it sort of resonate in your head as something that sounds good? There's so many chords, there's so many triads that you can play. There's major, there's minor, there's diminished, there's augmented, and it's more about playing those, hearing what they sound like, what kind of like emotion does a certain type of chord or a certain melody evoke, and committing that to like memory. So almost creating a hard drive of all these different sounds that you can kind of regurgitate at any given moment. I love taking chords and breaking them down so that they become like riffs. So for example, one of our songs people will recognize called Silent Flight Parliament, the first riff is just a each thing that I'm playing, which just sounds like a bunch of notes, but they're chords. It's a chord progression that's building to like a little bit of tension, and there's some dissonance there, and there's some diminished chords, and it helps to resolve the riff back to the original, which is just an E minor. Playing guitar is not just a physical activity. There's more to it than that. What about what you're playing sounds good, or sounds bad, or sounds evil, or sounds angry, or sounds happy or sad? To me, that's how you get better. In addition to all the metronome playing and burning through scales and stuff like that, the other side of that is to dig into what is it that kind of makes you feel something. Again, hard to put into words, but it takes a lot of years really to get there, I guess.